I told myself the mountains would remind us how to breathe, that up where the air thins and the world quiets, two people who had forgotten how to speak to each other might remember, not through grand gestures, but through silence that didn't sting. 12 years of marriage had layered us with histories and habits until tenderness became a practical checklist. Drop-offs, pickups, fixed faucets, unpaid invoices, school photographs ordered last minute and framed crooked in the hallway. We had two children who turned every weekday into choreography and every weekend into logistics. They were our pride and our proof, and somehow, the tide that pulled us in separate directions until we learned how not to meet in the middle. I booked the lodge because the brochure promised a lake like glass and pines that sang in the wind, and because the website listed no televisions in rooms as if it were a luxury, not a challenge. Clara scanned the confirmation email without comment, set her phone down, then picked it up again, thumb dragging across the screen the way a stone worries a palm. She didn't say yes or no so much as nod through me, a soft concession that landed on the table and lay there between coffee rings. We drove in the dark, the children left behind with her sister, who lived close enough to know our arguments by their echoes through the walls. Clara slept with her cheek against the window, the glass fogging and clearing with every breath, and I watched the highway unspool like a ribbon pulled through a closed fist. When the road narrowed to switchbacks and the pines thickened, dawn made a slow promise on the horizon, and the lodge finally appeared. A series of wooden ribs at the foot of a slope, smoke threading from a stone chimney into the cold. Inside, the floors creaked like old timbers settling after a storm, the air stitched with the smell of coffee and cedar, and the faint metallic breath of snow waiting in the clouds. The front desk clerk had a smile like a lantern and a stack of hand-drawn trail maps folded in thirds. He circled one, Ridge Walk, easy grade overlook that made people cry, in pencil as if he were sketching a route through a memory. In the great room, a mismatched collection of chairs circled a fireplace where someone had placed a tin full of chestnuts not for roasting, but for decoration, a gesture toward a tradition no one here would actually perform. Clara stood at the window of our room as if trying to memorize the world before it spoke to her in a language she'd forgotten, the lake a dark, patient mirror. The pines tensed like the backs of animals ready to run. She tucked her hair behind her ear and looked at me, not through me this time but into the space I occupied, as if measuring whether I fit there anymore. "It's beautiful," she said, and for a second I heard us 10 years ago, two people inventing the future like a game, scoring points for daring. "Let's make this count," I said, and heard the plea in my voice after it left me. We tried. The first day we walked the ridge trail slowly, stopping at every switchback as if the mountain required careful negotiation at each turn. The overlook appeared like an excuse to admit we were tired. We sat on a flat rock and watched the valley hold its breath below us. A hawk played the wind like an instrument, the lake below showing us a second sky we could never reach. Clara wrapped her scarf twice around her throat and pressed her chin into it, eyes half closed, not sleeping and not awake but suspended, and I wanted to say something that would make that expression stay. "Do you remember the first apartment?" I asked, because memory can sometimes be a rope lowered into a well. She smiled with half her mouth. "The radiator hissed all winter," she said, "and the windows gulped the street like it was soup." I laughed, not because the metaphor was particularly good, but because it was hers, and once that had been everything. We told the old stories like prayer beads, polish worn smooth by repetition, and when we ran out we watched the clouds comb the ridge and pretended the quiet was full. That night we ate at a small table by a window in the dining room where couples leaned toward each other over bowls of stew and glasses of red wine, as if proximity were a skill they had practiced. A guitarist near the hearth played songs the room knew without fully recognizing, melodies that suggested the memory of lyrics, notes moving like steam through the rafters. Clara kept picking her phone up and putting it down, thumb hovering, screen dark, then bright, then dark, each time like a sigh. I talked about the kids, about whether our son's sudden obsession with fossils meant a museum membership, whether we should switch our daughter's dance studio after the instructor's hours changed. These were not tender topics, but they had the decency to stay put, to hold still while we touched them with our words. At some point I said, "I'm glad we came," and she said, "Me too," and both of us meant it, and both of us also meant, "It will take more than this," though neither of us said that part out loud. I reached across the table, not for her hand but for the bottle to refill her glass. A safer motion, a motion with a purpose, and my sleeve brushed her wrist, and the contact felt like stepping onto a stair that isn't there. She pulled her hand back not quickly but reflexively, as if from heat, and then shook her head like she was trying to dislodge an apology that wasn't ready. When we walked back to our room, the guitarist had shifted to something faster, the room clapping softly in time, cutlery chiming against crockery like a second rhythm underneath. Clara paused, watched the guitarist's fingers dance across the strings, and smiled with an expression that made me both hopeful and afraid. "Do you want to stay?" I asked. She shook her head. "I'm a little tired," she said. "Let's save it." Save it for what? I didn't ask, because sometimes a question is a fuse and sometimes it's a wick, and I no longer trusted my hands with fire. Back in the room, the radiator clicked and ticked in the corner like it was counting the seconds between things said and unsaid. Clara washed her face at the little sink, water rushing the way trains rush past platforms, faces glimpsed and then gone. When she turned toward the bed, pale without makeup, hair damp at the temples, she looked precisely like herself and also like a stranger I admired. We lay on our backs as if parachuted into a landing without the strength to right ourselves. The lake beyond the window holding the sky steady because someone needed to. I waited for her to reach for me because she had once reached, often and without thinking, and when she didn't, I told myself the day had been long. In the morning the world had edged itself with frost, and we came into the great room to find a pamphlet tucked into the stack of newspapers. Winter Fest, one night only, local band, dance lesson before the show, mulled cider on the terrace, all ages welcome, bring your courage. The last line printed in a hand that felt mischievous. I tapped the paper the way you tap a window to get a bird's attention. "Looks fun," I said, making my voice easy, though fun was now a country it took a passport to enter. Clara tilted her head. "Maybe," she said, and then carefully folded the pamphlet and slid it into her coat pocket with the gentleness she had once reserved for notes I left in her lunch. All day the mountains put on a pageant, sun and shade crossing each other like rumor and truth trading places, and we let them entertain us because effort is easier when someone else is doing it. We walked a trail that threaded the pines like a needle moving through cloth, and when Clara stopped, I stopped, and when she started again, I followed 2 steps behind because that felt like the distance we had learned to keep. Once she reached for my arm when the path iced over, and we both pretended the gesture was practical. And once I brushed snow from her shoulder and pretended it took more time than it did. In the afternoon, we split a bowl of soup because it was cold, and because it was easier to share food than music or quiet or need. "Tonight," she said, touching the folded pamphlet like it might sprout wings. "Let's go," and I nodded, already trying to believe it would be enough. One good night in the ledger to balance years of what we didn't say. The terrace hung over the lake like a balcony over a stage, strings of lights draped from post to post making constellations the sky might have approved. The band was local, the kind that carries a town in the case with their instruments: fiddle, upright bass, a drum kit held together with tape and affection, a singer with a voice built for weather. A woman in a green scarf called out steps into a microphone, laughing easily when the couples on the terrace fumbled and recovered, turning missteps into choreography by naming them out loud. "Left, right, turn if you want. This is about bravery, not precision," she said, and everyone wanted to be brave if bravery meant mistakes forgiven at once. Clara's face did something I hadn't seen in years, loosened like a fist unclenching. She reached for my hand without looking, an instinct waking. I let our fingers lace, felt the old pattern of bone and tendon, a map my hands could still read in the dark. We tried to follow the steps, then failed, then laughed without apology, the kind of laughter that makes a person step closer to hear the end of it. The woman in the green scarf threaded through the crowd, tapping shoulders, offering corrections as if offering sugar, and when she reached us she said, Let the music move you. Don't force your feet to translate it. And I wondered how often good advice arrives in the wrong language. The band struck something faster, the terrace boards taking the beat and giving it back, and the crowd answered with its bodies, a not quite unison that sounded like joy. Clara let go of my hand to tuck her hair behind her ear, then didn't take it back. A man near us, tall, a knit cap pulled down to his eyebrows, a scarf the color of ripe apples, made an expansive gesture as if to say, "Look at all this," and Clara looked, eyebrows lifted in a way that made her look suddenly young and not mine. When the lesson ended, the woman in the green scarf invited everyone to keep dancing, however your history allows. And the phrasing made something in my chest tilt. The singer stepped to the microphone and told a story about a river that used to run where the lake is now, and about a woman who could hear its old voice under the new water if she stood in the right place. And then the band leaned into a song that gathered people like weather gathers leaves. Clara closed her eyes for a moment the way you close them at the first taste of something remembered and loved. And when she opened them, a man I did not know was standing in front of her, with a hand held out in formal invitation, as if the night itself had sent him. He was not remarkable, no glow, no signifier of narrative threat. But he had a generosity in his posture, an ease that suggested he knew how to carry other people's weight lightly. He nodded to me with a politeness that acknowledged both my presence and my irrelevance, and I felt something in me sit down hard. Clara looked at me for a permission I had never denied her, and I gave it in a nod that felt both graceful and cheap. I stepped back to the edge of the terrace, where a barrel held cups of cider steaming like small inventions meant to solve only the hour they exist in. The night was tuned just sharp of cold, breath visible, fingers stiffening, and then warming around paper cups, and the lights above hummed with their own weather. The band shifted into a waltz with a rebellious heart, and Clara moved into it as if into a room she had once loved living in. The man's hand rested at the small of her back, not proprietorial but confident in its assignment, and she laughed in a way that opened her throat and softened the lines that worry had etched around her mouth. It is possible to be proud and undone by the same sight. There she was, alive in a way I had not seen, or had not made room for, or had forgotten to invite, and what I felt was not exactly jealousy, not exactly rage, but a keen awareness of the river under the lake, the sound of something older pouring through the shape of the present. I wanted to say, I know that person, and also, I forgot that person, and also, I forgot to be the person who made that person laugh. But language, when it arrives late, has to pay a fee. A woman beside me said, to no one in particular, "People think dancing is about steps, but it's about listening without words." And I thought that might be the whole problem and the whole solution, which is worse because solutions demand work. Clara and the man turned in a circle that tightened and loosened like a story about two people who understand the same thing differently. And my hands went hot, and then cold, and then nothing. The cider tasted like a memory of fruit that had decided to survive winter by burning. When the song ended, there was applause that felt less like approval and more like relief, and Clara put her hand to the man's arm in casual gratitude, and he bent his head to hear some brief nothing that made them both smile in the way of people acknowledging the exact same moment for precisely the same reason. She looked over the heads of the crowd, found me at the periphery the way one locates a coat one will need later, and lifted her hand in a gesture that could have meant, wait, or don't wait, or this is nothing, or this is something but not what you fear. The band did not ask permission to keep going. The next song arrived as if it had been invited weeks ago and only now got here, breathless and unapologetic. The man gestured again and Clara nodded before she looked at me, and the nod traveled through me like a small, precise blade finding the seam between two plates of armor. She stepped forward, I stepped backward. Sometimes that is the choreography that saves people, sometimes it is the one that teaches them how to leave. I didn't storm. The band was too gentle for that and the mountain too indifferent. I walked along the rail as if reading a plaque that described events that once happened here at this very spot, names and dates, and a sentence about the weather. I found the stairs, descended to the path that laced the lake like a ribbon threaded through islets, and followed it until the music thinned to rhythm and then to rumor. The pines made that sound they make when they talk privately to the wind, the old, confiding noise that makes your secrets want to lean out of your pockets. It would be easy to say that at a certain bend in the path something in me broke, but what happened was quieter and somehow less dramatic and more permanent. The part of me that had insisted on the story of us as a single narrative reluctantly admitted there were two stories that met often, shared chapters, then fell out of sync and kept writing alone. I stood at a wooden bench damp with cold and touched it like it could answer a question, but wood is old and wise and chooses its moments. Somewhere behind me, a cheer rose and then flattened into laughter, and I told myself it was for something harmless, the way people do when they want the world to cooperate with their hope. Back on the terrace, Clara was nowhere near the cider but caught mid-spin, hair shaken loose, sweater lifting a little at the waist to show a centimeter of skin like a secret that had always been there. The man's hand wasn't intrusive, but it was comfortable, and comfort can sometimes be a greater risk than desire because it sneaks in under the door. Clara's eyes were wet not with tears but with air and movement and something like relief, and when she spotted me again, she didn't look away but she didn't come toward me either, and in that neither the night made its decision. When the set broke, I stepped into the space where the band's last notes still shivered and said, "Can we talk?" The way you ask a child to come away from the edge of the pool. Clara's face tightened, and then smoothed as if she had decided not to be tired yet. The man, reading the room with an accuracy that made me both grateful and furious, tipped an invisible hat and drifted toward the bass player who was telling a joke with his hands. We moved to a corner of the terrace, near a stack of firewood, where the smell of sap and smoke made everything seem more honest than it was. I said a thing that was neither careful nor cruel, but, as it turned out, useless. "This doesn't feel right." She tilted her head like a bird considering a sound in the grass. "Feel to whom?" she asked, and I wished for a world where the plural was simpler. "To me," I said, "to us. I don't know how to stand near you while you find your breath in the same air as someone else." She looked at me, and something like pity crossed her face and left quickly, ashamed of itself. "We came here to remember," she said softly. "I can't remember anything if I'm always careful of your fear." "It would be clean and dramatic to say," I said, "if you go back out there, I won't be here when you return." But there was no threat, only an observation that arrived like weather reports arrive, factual and unassailable. "I can't stand here and pretend it doesn't undo me," I said. She took a breath and said the thing that later would be the part I rewound to repeatedly until it wore thin in my hands. "You've been gone a long time," she said. "I learned to breathe without you, and I didn't notice until now that I never stopped." There was no villain on the terrace. The band tuned for the next set, couples rubbed their hands together over the barrels like pilgrims of warmth, and love itself stood slightly to the left of where we had placed it and refused to move back. I nodded as if she had told me the weather and I had decided, accordingly, to bring in the chairs. Then she turned away, not toward the man with the scarf but toward the music, and I stepped into the stairwell shadow and let the mountain keep the rest of my words. The room smelled like damp wool and cedar, the way old trunks smell when they haven't been opened, except to tuck the past inside. I put my suitcase on the bed without turning on the light, letting the window's square of thin moonlight be enough. Packing is always a story told in reverse. Shirts folded back into their original language, toiletries retreating into travel sizes that insist nothing is permanent. I moved slowly because haste makes even the smallest tasks aggressive, and I wanted my leaving to be quiet enough to fit in my pocket if I needed to take it out later and look at it under different light. There is a particular humiliation to leaving without being asked to stay. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady. A tide that was always on the schedule. I pictured our children asleep in their aunt's spare room, two bodies that never took up as much space as their noises suggested, and felt the sudden rush of wanting to be where someone might murmur my name without thinking. I sent a message to my sister-in-law to say we'd be back early and immediately wrote a second message, undoing the first because we would not be back. and the correction made my chest tighten like a drum phrase played too long. My phone lit the way an aquarium lights a room, blue and detached. No messages from Clara, no missed calls. The quiet between us had never been this official. I packed the sweater she bought me 4 winters ago at a pop-up market where we ate from paper boats under strings of bulbs, and I realized it smelled like the drawer more than her. A small thing, but small things are how the roof lets in weather. I left the pamphlet, Winter Fest, Bring Your Courage, folded on the nightstand because it felt like littering to take it. Clara's scarf lay across the chair back the way a woman throws a question across a room and doesn't wait to see who answers. I stood for a second and put my hand on the scarf expecting some current to pass into me, a charge, a message, a warmth, forgetting that fabric does not keep what we ask it to. The drive down the mountain took the turning slower than it had brought us up, the tires talking to gravel, the guardrails reflecting my headlights back like tired eyes. I kept the radio off because songs would choose me with cruel accuracy, and silence had the decency to be general. The valley opened like a held breath let go, and the interstate accepted me without ceremony the way a river accepts rain. At a gas station off exit 41, a clerk sold me coffee that tasted like a story about coffee told by someone who had only ever seen pictures, and I drank it like penance. By the time I reached our street, the sky had lightened in that way cities manage, without fanfare, simply dimming the room so you realize you've stayed longer than planned. The house looked like an answer returned unopened. Inside, the heating kicked on and the vents whispered at the floorboards like co-conspirators. I put my suitcase beside the couch rather than in the bedroom because decisions are easier in rooms where you don't sleep. I didn't cry, not because I am brave or numb, but because the body sometimes chooses different rituals than the mind would select. I walked from room to room as if items might volunteer their origins. This mug from that trip, this dent in the table from that afternoon, our son discovered how spoons sound when thrown, like a museum audio guide narrating tenderness. On the bookshelf, a photo faced outward I didn't remember placing. Clara on a summer sidewalk holding an ice cream cone, looking off to the left of the frame like someone had called her name from a different life. I set the picture down face, first not because I couldn't bear it but because I wanted something in the room to mirror my position. The quiet that followed had weight, not the empty quiet of absence, but the present quiet of something sitting with you uninvited and not leaving because your discomfort doesn't move it. I lay on the couch and watched the shadows do their work, lengthening and shrinking as cars threw their brief influence through the blinds. Sleep arrived not as mercy, but as an officiant who merely notes what happens and signs the form. In the days that followed, the practicalities found me the way birds find seed even if you don't put it out. Texts about the children's schedules, emails about bills, a notice from the school about a winter assembly where our daughter would be a tree and our son a glacier. The casting unfair in ways no one could fix. Clara called once and said my name like a question whose answer she already knew but needed to hear aloud. "I don't understand why you left like that," she said, and I let the sentence sit between us as if it might hatch something if warmed long enough. "It wasn't about the dance," I said, the words arriving as if they had been circling the block looking for parking. "It's about learning the sound of your breath in a room that I am also in and realizing it keeps its own time." She exhaled into the phone, and distance made it sound like weather. "You make everything poetry so you don't have to name it," she said without cruelty. "Name it then," I said, as if inviting an executioner to choose the blade. "I don't want to be careful anymore," she said, and I imagined her in the kitchen standing with the phone to her ear, looking at the window not because anything was there, but because windows perform the idea of looking out. "With you I am always careful." The call ended not with a click, but with the lack of a human being on the other end, which is a different kind of ending. I started cleaning the house the way people start running after they have been told something about their heart. Drawers, cabinets, closets, each a small archaeology of the life we had built and then stacked against itself. I found a note from our son, 3 years old when he wrote it, a son with 30 rays and the word dad spelled D-A-D-N, which felt more honest. I found a program from a dance recital where Clara had circled someone else's name, an arrow drawn toward it and the word brave written in the margin, and wondered if she had been trying to guide her gaze for years. At night the house made all its small animal sounds, and I let them move through me like a river through reeds. I stopped rehearsing the argument on the terrace because every rehearsal changed the lines until even I couldn't remember what had been said. When Clara called again, it was to discuss the winter assembly and whether I would sit on the left aisle or the right aisle so the children could find both of us. An arrangement of bodies as choreography, Mercy built from map reading. We agreed like diplomats. Left aisle for me, right for her, wave at the appropriate measure, the distance between us named and managed. The elementary school auditorium smelled like crayons that had aspirations beyond coloring and like floor polish and like the faint panic of small performances. Parents in sweaters unwound scarves and found their faces in the bad lighting. And teachers herded children into lines using those shhhhh sounds that are not shushing so much as casting a spell. The program listed each class's offering as if we had all purchased tickets to a series of rehearsed adorations of the world. Snowflake's Song, Night of Lights, The Animals' Sleep, and finally, The Mountain's Lullaby, Miss Keating's third grade. I sat on the left aisle, third row, aisle seat. The place where you can leave without being noticed, but also where every late arrival touches your shoulder as they pass. Clara sat across the room on the right aisle, fourth row, hair tucked into a coat collar, scarf dark against a dark sweater, her posture a question mark that had decided against punctuation. We did not wave because waving presumes one wants to be seen by the one waved at. Our daughter's class was a grove of painted cardboard trees with green capes, the children's faces solemn with the gravity of remembering when to sway. She found me with her eyes at once, and then found Clara, and then looked between us, as if we had been placed there for a reason she could not name but felt was important. When the music started, the children swayed like a forest that has clandestinely learned choreography, and I felt the kind of pride that feels like your body has remembered how to be an instrument. Our son's class, The Mountain's Lullaby, was a procession of cardboard peaks held by children who had been told not to run and who obeyed as best they could. He wore a blue paper triangle labeled Glacier in black marker, and the earnestness of it was so precise I wanted to stand and salute. He scanned the audience and found me, then found Clara, and then did something I did not expect. He smiled, a small, contained smile that did not ask for permission to be happy in a room arranged by adults. The music they sang had only 3 notes, but it held the room because the children believed in it, and belief can be rhythm if sung in unison. For a moment I forgot the terrace, the scarf, the cider, the cold air, the way Clara's face had made and unmade decisions without me. I stood in a gymnatorium while children dressed as landforms reminded me that the world's patience is older than ours. When the last note was held too long the way children hold last notes like sugar in their mouths, the applause seemed to lift the ceiling tiles and let out a less stale sky. Afterward there was the chaos of retrieval, parents inventing pathways, children inventing obstacles, teachers nodding bravely. I reached our daughter first, bent so she could hang her arms around my neck, and when she whispered, "Was I a good tree?" I said, "You were the idea of tree," and she said, "What's an idea?" Which is the right question always. Our son approached with the glacier hat in his hands like a crown he wasn't sure he should keep, and I said, "That was very old of you." And he didn't ask what I meant because sometimes love is letting language be ridiculous. Clara arrived then, flushed, eyes bright, coat unbuttoned, and for a second we stood like people in a painting placed on either side of the subject that mattered. The children spoke over each other about swaying and remembering, and how someone in the back row burped during the animal's sleep, and Clara and I listened like a single audience. When the story ended and the coats were zipped and the hats were lost and found, Clara said, "We'll talk," and I said, "We will," and the future did not flinch. Weeks became a calendar you could look at without wincing. The practicalities became choreography we could perform without injuring the furniture. Mondays and Tuesdays with me, Wednesdays and Thursdays with Clara, weekends alternating like the good weather in spring. A lawyer with careful glasses translated our intentions into pages that made a sound like doors opening and closing when you flipped them. We cried once in the parking lot after signing, and it was a good cry, the kind that acknowledges the existence of both rain and roofs. In the new apartment, I hung one picture, the mountain lake from a calendar someone gave me at work, the month torn off so the scene could be itself. It was not the same lake, but lakes learn each other's names the way birds do, and I liked pretending it knew what I meant. On Saturdays, when the children were with Clara, I walked the park that stitched the city to itself, a loop that offered geese and joggers and the gentle ambition of old men playing chess in coats. I learned that coffee tastes different when no one is watching you drink it. Clara sent a picture of the children making pancakes, flour everywhere, our son writing his name in it with a finger, our daughter catching the light with her hair like a net. I sent a picture of the park path with the caption, "Today the pond is pretending to be a sky," and she didn't reply, which felt right. On a Tuesday in late winter she texted simply, "I danced," and I wrote back, "Good," and meant it without qualifiers. Sometimes at night, the apartment so quiet it sounded like it was listening on purpose, I thought of the woman in the green scarf saying, "This is about bravery, not precision," and decided that maybe we had been brave in the wrong direction for a long time and were now simply turning to face another wind. The memory of the terrace did not hurt less, but it changed shape. Not a blade anymore, but a creek stone. Something you can turn in your hand until it warms and belongs to you as much as to the water that made it. When grief came, it was not punitive but companionable. The kind of grief that sits at the table with you and eats quietly and does not ask for the salt. Spring arrived with its arrogance and its permission, and one afternoon I took the children to the park, and we rented a small rowboat because the sign said no standing and we wanted to obey something. Our son rowed with the seriousness of someone who had finally been given a lever to move the world. Our daughter splashed her hand and declared herself an otter. A couple on the shore danced to music from a phone speaker, small steps, nothing showy, but their ease made the air around them kind. The children asked if I could dance like that, and I said, "Not yet." And they accepted my answer like you accept that rain is wet and you are not in charge of it. On the way home, our daughter fell asleep, and our son looked out the window in the way of someone memorizing a route so he can return alone someday. At a red light, my phone buzzed and a message arrived from Clara. A picture of the Mountain Lodge flyer, "Winterfest, bring your courage," and beneath it, not a caption but a period, a mark that meant both ending and sentence. I typed and erased and typed and erased and then sent nothing because not every thought needs to leave the room. At night, I dreamt sometimes of pines making that private sound, of a lake holding sky, of a terrace where people made bravery look like missteps forgiven. And when I woke, the room was small and mine and merciful. I lay there listening to the apartment's unambitious heart, and I did not think of fixing anything. I thought of learning how to listen without words, and then, maybe, if the song asked nicely how to move.